Okay, welcome back. You listened to some of these cases on past life regression. We will continue by focusing now for a while on the cases that do not necessarily require hypnosis. These are mostly cases of children who remember a past life and give an accurate, detailed description of it. Dr. Jim Tucker, Associate Professor of Psychiatry at University of Virginia, investigated several cases of these children who remember past lives.
I got involved with the work in the mid-90s. At that point I was in private practice psychiatry, just having a nice mainstream career. When I became more open to these things, when I remarried, my wife was certainly open to things like psychic experiences, which got me curious about them. I do continue to do a lot of clinical work, seeing patients, but I also am involved in this research. And what this research involves, this phenomenon, is very young children, usually around the age of 2 or 3, who start saying that they remember a previous life. These children are found all over the world. They're easiest to find in cultures with a belief in reincarnation, but we're finding more and more American cases as well. And some of them talk about being deceased family members, but others describe being strangers in other locations, and if they give enough details, then people have often gone to those locations and found that in fact someone had died whose life matches the details that the child gave. The cases vary. There are some cases that are quite weak, where the child talks about a previous life but doesn't give enough details where a match has been located. And of course those aren't really the interesting ones. I mean, there are also some very strong cases where the child comes out with very specific details that would basically only match for one person that had lived. Strong cases can involve different aspects. Certainly for a child to make statements about a stranger who lived in another location some distance away is stronger than a child who's describing a family member or someone in the same village. And we've got lots of cases of both types, of both strangers versus same family cases or people in the same village. Obviously, the more verified statements, the stronger a case it is. Particularly if we've got written records, that makes it even stronger. Then you've got the birthmark and birth defect cases where you can get some incredible matches where both an entrance wound and an exit wound that matches where the previous person was shot and killed. That can certainly make for a very strong case. And then you've got the sort of associated features like the emotional longing or some of the behaviors like phobias related to the mode of death of the previous person. In cases where the previous person died violently, over 35% of the children show a phobia related to that mode of death. You get children who in their play will repeatedly act out something from the previous life, usually the previous occupation. And some of those can be the children can be very driven to do that repeatedly. So those sorts of associated features, when you see them along with a lot of specific statements, really make cases quite strong. In the strongest cases, the children have given a lot of very specific details, including a lot of names. There's one case in Lebanon that Ian Stevenson investigated where the child came out with 25 names of people from the previous life, and not just names, but their relationship to the previous person. And there are a number of others with similar type of specificity, although that girl holds the record for names. But for instance, there's a little girl in Sri Lanka, Purnima, who talked about the life of an incense maker who had been hit by a truck and killed, and she actually named the brands of incense that she said she was selling at the time. Those were brands that were not available locally, but eventually the family was able to track down this person who lived in the area where Purnima said he had lived, and he was killed on his bike selling incense. and the incense he was selling was the brands that she had named. And there are a number of others where you're talking about very specific details that seemingly the child had no way of knowing. And I think enough details where coincidence really is not a reasonable explanation. So, you know, they would certainly suggest that in some cases at least, there are some very strong memories and very specific memories that seemingly have carried over from somebody who died. The other thing that I've been focusing on is the database that we have for these cases. Now, we've got over 2,500 cases registered in our files. What we then do is take all the information from each case, put it in a coding form where we code for 200 variables for each case and then put them in a database. And that is very labor intensive. We've got about 1,400 of the cases in the database now, but that's enough where we can then look at things and see features that we've not been able to see from individual cases.
You listen to Jim Tucker interview. Carol Bowman, therapist and counselor, talks about her cases of past life memories in young children.
I'm going to talk to you today about my favorite topic, children's past life memories. And I've been investigating cases of children's past life memories for the past 22 years after both of my children had spontaneous past life memories and were also healed of chronic problems by remembering their previous lives. In 1988, when my son, who was 5 at the time, Chase, first started becoming terrified of loud booming sounds. And on this particular occasion, when Chase was 5, as soon as the fireworks began, he became absolutely hysterical. And it went beyond just crying. He was inconsolable. After about an hour, he calmed down. And as anyone with children knows, sometimes things just happen with children and we don't know the reason. So this was very unusual for Chase because he was a very fearless child. He was not afraid of anything, and these sounds absolutely terrified him. About 3 weeks after this event, we were at an indoor swimming pool, and as soon as anyone went on the diving board, it made a big booming sound in the building. And as soon as we entered the building, Chase pulled me out, and he became hysterical again. He was crying and sobbing. And I realized that it was the sounds that were frightening him, and I really didn't know what to do about it. He was supposed to start school, and I was afraid that they would call me from school saying, please come and get Chase because he's absolutely hysterical and we can't calm him down. And Norman, who was very well versed in past life therapy with adults, sensed that Chase was accessing past life memory. And he said to Chase, continue, what happens? Chase said, I'm a soldier. I'm a man. I'm hiding behind a rock. I'm holding a gun with a long sword at the end. There's smoke everywhere. I'm confused. I don't even know who I'm shooting at. I'm shot in the wrist. And he held his right wrist. And he said, they take me to a hospital, but it's not like a regular hospital. It's poles in the ground with some material covering the poles. And he said they put me on a bench, a bed, but it's a hard bench. And he said they wrap my wrist in a bandage and they make me go back to battle. I don't want to go. I miss my wife and family. I think at that moment when Chase, 5-year-old Chase, mentioned that he had a wife and family, I think I went into a mild state of shock. That Chase, the place where Chase said he was shot on his wrist, that's the site of his eczema. Since Chase had been a baby, he had a chronic and severe eczema on that spot on his wrist which he used to scratch and scratch and scratch, to the point where I had to bandage it at night so I wouldn't have to change bloodied sheets every morning. Well, Norman explained that probably this was a war memory of Chase's, and that the sound of the loud booming sounds reminded him of a cannon or gunfire, and this triggered his memory. And he just said, let's see what happens. Well, within a few weeks, Chase asked for his first drum set, and he started making big booming sounds every day. And that chronic eczema on his wrist, which had not responded to any medical treatment. It had not responded to antibiotic salves, homeopathy, food elimination diets, nothing. Within a few days, that eczema completely disappeared. So I think that was a turning point in my life. So as I started doing my own research, I started advertising in magazines, asking other parents if they had cases of their own children. I wrote a couple of articles, one for the Edgar Cayce Foundation and another for a professional organization. And I started getting letters from parents all over the United States whose children had past life memories. And I started seeing the patterns in these cases. And one of the things that stood out for the parents was that when children talk about past lives, and we're talking about children usually under the age of 5, 2, 3, 4 years old, sometimes as soon as they begin talking, they will talk about when they were big before or when they died. And they talk about it in a very serious tone of voice. It's not the usual, oh, I used to have a horse, or I lived on a farm. It's very serious and direct. They're very insistent that this is something that really happened, that they aren't making this up. They also talk about things that there is no way that they could ordinarily know in their 2, 3, or 4 years of worldly experience in this life. And those statements are sometimes very significant when they talk about when they were big before and their family died in the fire, or they asked to go back to another family. We notice these comments. Well, what I found very interesting too is that when little children have these memories, they will repeat the same story over a period of months or even a couple of years, as you will see in some of the cases that I talk about today. So there's a consistency of the story over time. I got a case from a mother, again in Chicago. I don't know why Chicago is such a psychically active place for children, but it appears to be. And in this case, the mother, Kathy, had been a teenage mother and had a 2-year-old who died of neuroblastoma. At the time of his death, he had tumors all over his body. He had a large tumor behind his left eye, which caused blindness. He had been in the hospital, and they had inserted an IV in his neck, which left a surgical scar. He had a large tumor behind his right ear that they had biopsied. And at some point, they just said, take him home. There's nothing more we can do for him. And he died at age 2. Well, Kathy married, had a daughter, a son, and then had this other child who is Chad, who was delivered by C-section 12 years after the first child died. The new baby was named Chad. As soon as the mother gave birth, the doctors came into the room and said, we have bad news. It looks like your baby is blind in his left eye. She said, please bring me my baby. She looked at him, and he had what looked like a surgical scar in his neck and what looked like a large tumor behind his right ear. And she said, how can this be? And the doctor said, oh, well, we don't know why he's blind, and that's just a birthmark, and that's just a cyst. But when Kathy held this child for the first time, there was a familiar feel to the child. And she was raised in a very Christian, Midwestern American home had never read a book about reincarnation, but in that moment she knew somehow the soul of that first child was in this new child. At age 4, he started talking about his other life, and he asked Kathy to go back to the other home where they had lived before, and he described the home where she had lived with the other child. And Kathy asked, "Why do you want to go back there?" And he said, "Because I left you there."
You listened to Carol Bowman and her cases, her own cases of past life memories in young children. Next, I would like to share with you a case of reincarnation in the United States, well covered by documents and press. Case of James Leininger.
And now, one of the biggest questions of life. What happens when it's over? Heaven? Hell? Nothing? Or might there be a fourth possibility, reincarnation? Could we come back as someone else? Here's Chris Cuomo with 2 down-to-earth parents who thought they understood the mysteries of life. That is, until their toddler began to talk.
On March 3rd, 1945, a 21-year-old Navy fighter pilot on a mission over the Pacific was shot down by Japanese artillery. His name might well have been forgotten, were it not for the remarkable, some might say unbelievable story of a little boy named James.
Okay, this is me tough. I need somebody to help me.
All right, I'm the volunteer. What do you want me to do?
Okay, just go climb this thing and you have to hold me in case I fall.
Done.
James Leininger is all boy, 6 years old, and full of spirit.
This is a special plane that goes in reverse. You don't see a lot of that.
James knows a lot about planes, especially war planes.
What kind of airplane is that?
Your car's there.
His parents, Andrea and Bruce Leininger, say from an early age James would play with nothing else.
He was obsessed with airplanes. You look around the house, that's all you'll see. Airplanes, helicopters, aircraft carriers.
But then, when he was 2, the planes James loved suddenly began to give him frequent and frightening nightmares.
I'd wake him up and he'd be screaming and he'd always be laying on his back, kicking his feet up at the ceiling. And I'd say, "Baby, what were you dreaming about?" And he'd say, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out."
They sound like typical kiddie nightmares, but Andrea says they went on the same way for months. Maybe too much TV, but James was just 2 and his parents say only watching Barney and Teletubbies.
Teletubbies!
And Andrea and Bruce say they weren't watching World War II documentaries or conversing about military history.
This is an F-18?
No, that one.
So what explains the nightmares and James's strange obsession with airplanes?
I talked to my mom about it a lot of times, and my mom had said maybe he's remembering a past life.
What did you say?
Politely, baloney.
Andrea and Bruce of Lafayette, Louisiana are a highly educated, modern couple. To them, the possibility that their little son James was manifesting signs of a former life was, well, a little out there.
You know, having a past life is not the initial conclusion that you come to. You try and figure out any other way he could have. Did he see anything? Has there been anything on television, anything that we've discussed?
But as time went by, Andrea didn't know what to believe. Here's James at age 3, going over a plane as if he's doing a pre-flight check. He would continue to say and do things that were puzzling, like the time his mom bought him a toy airplane.
And I said, "Oh, look, there's a bomb on the bottom of it." He said, "That's not a bomb, Mama, that's a drop tank."
A drop tank?
I'd never heard of a drop tank. I didn't know what a drop tank was.
Andrea's mother suggested she look into the work of counselor and therapist Carol Bowman. Bowman has written 2 books, both supporting the proposition that sometimes the dead can be reborn.
We are taught from a very early age in this culture, in the Judeo-Christian culture, that reincarnation doesn't exist. Once you observe this in a child, and the evidence is very compelling, you have to open up to another explanation for what is going on.
Bruce was deeply skeptical.
He said there has to be a logical explanation.
I don't believe in past lives. I don't believe in this stuff.
But with the violent nightmares recurring 3 and 4 times a week, the Leiningers felt they had to do something. So with guidance from Bowman, they cautiously began to encourage James to share his memories. They say The result was startling.
The nightmares immediately started reducing in frequency. He went down from 3 or 4 times a week to maybe 1 a week, 1 every other week. And at that point was when he started to articulate more about these past life memories.
Seems normal enough, a little boy improving when his troubles are directly addressed. But Bowman says this is more, that James was forthcoming because this is the age when former lives are most easily recalled.
They haven't had the cultural conditioning, the layering over of experience in this life, so that the memories can percolate up more easily. These memories tend to fade between the ages of 5 to 7.
His parents say between the ages of 2 and 4, James would reveal extraordinary details about the life of a former fighter pilot, mostly at bedtime, when he was drowsy.
Bruce said, what happened to your plane? He said, it crashed on fire. And Bruce said, why did your airplane crash? And he said, it got shot. And Bruce said, well, who shot your plane? And I'll never forget the look on his face. He went, the Japanese!
Still, despite these extraordinary stories, Bruce remained dubious, almost to prove they couldn't be true. He began to piece together the details James was sharing. And what he found, he says, shook him to the core. For in many instances, the stories appeared to match the facts. James seemed to be recalling real events, real people, in the life of a man who'd been dead for almost 60 years.
Coming up, a toddler, just 3 years old. So how does he know the pilots from a World War II squadron?
That was like, holy mackerel. You could have poured my brains out of my ears. I just couldn't believe it.
When Prime Time continues.
With each passing month, little James Leininger seemed to be peeling back memories of a past life.
Hey.
Vivid memories that scared and astonished his parents.
Bruce had always said, what kind of plane did you fly? And he said, a Corsair.
Yeah.
He said a Corsair?
He said the word Corsair.
Mm-hmm.
Not only did James remember flying a Corsair, he demonstrated knowledge of the plane's peculiarities, like the time he was flipping through a book about planes when he was 4.
And he got to the Corsair, and he said, that's a Corsair. And he goes, you know what? They used to get flat tires all the time.
In fact, historians and pilots agree that the plane's tires took a lot of punishment on landing. Of course, this is a fact that could easily be found in books or on TV. But then, James began to offer up the kinds of specific details his parents say are harder to explain away.
Another night, Bruce had come in and he said, do you remember where your plane took off? And he said it took off of a boat. Do you remember the name of your boat? Natoma. Do you remember what your name was? And he'd always say, James. His name is James. It never really occurred to us. We thought he just wasn't understanding the question. So I said, do you remember any friends or anyone else that you flew with? And he said, Jack Larson.
Bruce began doing some research. Almost immediately, he discovered that the Natoma was an actual ship, a small aircraft carrier in the Pacific called the Natoma Bay. And Jack Larson, the Navy buddy little James recalled? Well, it turns out there was a pilot named Jack Larson who served aboard the Natoma Bay. In fact, he's alive and well and living in Arkansas.
And it was like, holy mackerel. I mean, really, you could have poured my brains out of my ears. And I just couldn't believe it.
And there were more clues. Around this time, James began signing crayon drawings and other artwork, James 3.
One day I asked him why he's calling himself James 3. Well, it's because I'm the third James. And every once in a while you ask him that today, and he'll still say the same thing.
And one day, while leafing through a new book about the Battle of Iwo Jima, Bruce turned to an aerial photo of the Pacific Island. James was seated nearby.
He pointed to it and goes, Daddy, that's where my airplane was shot down. And I said, what? That's my airplane got shot down there, Daddy. And I just went blank. I couldn't say anything.
By then, Bruce had become a man possessed, searching the internet, combing through military records, and interviewing men who served aboard the Natoma Bay. Finally, a breakthrough. He learned that there was just one pilot from the squadron killed at Iwo Jima. That pilot, James M. Houston Jr. Is this why little James was calling himself James 3?
It just crystallized in my mind. This has to be who we're talking about. You know, my meter of skepticism was starting to go over toward belief.
When little James would describe being shot down, he told of how his plane had sustained a direct hit on the engine.
We had an airplane, and I said, well, can you show me where it was? And he pointed right up to the front of the engine.
That's what makes this man's story so intriguing. His name is Ralph Clarber. Clarber was a rear gunner on a TBM Avenger that flew off the Natoma Bay. On March 3rd, 1945, he took part in a raid near Iwo Jima. As it happens, Clarber's plane was right next to the one flown by James M. Houston Jr. It was to be Hugh's last mission before leaving for home the following day. As Clarber recalls, the sky was thick with enemy flak.
We experienced a pretty heavy aircraft fire, but this was the most intense that I experienced at any time.
Suddenly, a flash near the nose of Houston's plane.
I saw the hit. I would say he was hit head on. Yeah, right on the middle of the engine.
Just as little James had described it.
So what do you believe now about your son James?
I believe that he had a past life. I believe that in his past life he was James M. Houston Jr. And he came back because he wasn't finished with something. And that's essentially what I believe.
Dear Bruce and Andrea.
And he's not the only one. This past October, the Leinegers received a letter from a woman named Ann Barron, the sister of pilot James Houston. Andrea and Bruce had contacted her about their little boy. Barron heard about what young James was saying, and she believes.
All of this is still overwhelming. I can only imagine how it has affected you, but I believe, with my love to you, Anne. The child was so convincing and coming up with all these things that there's no way in the world he could know, unless there is a spiritual thing.
I think that the parents are self-deceived, that they're fascinated by the mysterious, and they've built up a fairy tale.
Professor Paul Kurtz at the University of Buffalo heads an organization that investigates claims of the paranormal.
He's overhearing conversations of his parents. He's looking at cues. He may talk to his little friends or hear from neighbors. And then this conviction that builds up that yes, he was this pilot, and yes, he will come to believe that himself.
Do you ever rack your brain and say, gee, I hope I didn't say anything or do anything that put this in James' head? Do you ever question yourself still or no?
No, because we're talking to a 2-year-old. You know, I mean, what am I going to do? Sit him in a corner and say, listen, now we're going to concoct this elaborate scheme, and you're going to imagine that you went through those things.
I knew what he watched on television. I knew what stories I read to him. I'm a protective, first-time Southern mother. There was no other place he could have been getting this information.
Assuming the Leiners are acting in good faith, what we have here is a classic conflict of faith versus science. Hard facts against beliefs that often can't be easily explained. There's no doubt where Paul Kurtz stands.
People have a right to believe, surely in America, there's freedom of conscience. On the other hand, do you want to believe in something that is false?
So how do you rationalize a belief in anything bigger than ourselves if you have to fall back on science all the time?
Not simply science, on the facts, on common sense.
Once upon a time, the Leinegers might have agreed. But that was before the amazing stories told by their young son forced them to consider the possibilities and to examine their faith.
Whether you believe in reincarnation or not, it's about the eternal life of the human spirit.
That's right.
And that's something God promises to us. There is something else out there. After this, it's not over when you die.
James's vivid recollections are starting to fade as he gets older. But among his prized possessions are 2 gifts sent to him by pilot James Houston's sister. A bust of George Washington and a model of a Corsair aircraft. They were among the personal effects of James Houston, sent home after the war.
Do you feel differently about James? Has this changed your relationship with him?
No. We have always felt that he's a special little boy because he's our son. He appears to have experienced something that I don't think is unique, but the way it's been revealed is quite astounding. it doesn't change how we think. I don't look at him and say, that's not my son, that's someone else. That's my boy. Good one!
It might be a natural assumption that it's just Buddhists and Hindus who believe in reincarnation, but would it surprise you to know that 1 out of every 4 Americans, Christians and Jewish alike, believe that souls do return again in different bodies? We'll be right back.
Another documentary prepared a few years later from an independent source about the same case.
Today, James Leininger is 12.
This plane, the Wildcat, is the plane that James M. Houston crashed in. And he was a test pilot for Corsair. And he would test fly those off of carriers. The F-18 is the plane I want to fly when I grow up.
Since he was 2, James showed an unusual fascination for military air shows and an uncanny familiarity with vintage aircraft. His parents cautiously made contact with James Houston's only surviving relative, his sister Anne. At first, she didn't know what to think about the little boy who claimed to be her brother reincarnated. But then, James asked her for a painting that only one person other than her knew existed.
She sent this January 16th, 2006. Says, Dear James, I do hope that this is the picture you asked for. It is the only one of me done by my mother. I am sorry to be so long sending it to you. These past few weeks have been very busy and hectic. I hope you like it. With my love, Annie.
James believed then, as he does now, that it was the dead pilot's soul asking for that picture.
I had asked her for a painting that my past mother had done for her and me. This was in her attic for 50 or so years. My parents and she thought it was crazy that I would know about something like this.
Anne, too, became a believer. And there were other, more chilling connections. James had 3 G.I. Joes he named Billy, Walter, and Leon. Names his parents thought were strange for a boy to choose.
Bruce is like, hey James, what are you going to name your G.I. Joe? And he just plain goes, Walter. So we were like, Walter? And Bruce goes, how come you named your G.I. Joes Billy, Walter, and Leon? And he goes, because that's who met me when I got to heaven. And it was one of those moments where like the blood drained out of our face, and we just kind of walked backwards. Bruce went in the office, I went in the office, we closed the door. He's in there going through papers like this. I'm like, what are you looking for? What are you looking for? He finds this piece of paper, and he says, Billy Peeler, Walter Devlin, and Leon Connor were all in the same squadron as James Houston. I was like, when did they die? Did they die before? He's throwing papers around, pulls out another sheet, and he looked at the dates of death, and they all died before James Houston died.
They all flew with him.
Although James's dad remained skeptical that reincarnation might really be possible, what happened next was uncanny.
So we're cleaning up the yard. He's playing in the leaves. I said, I just love you to bits. And he goes, well, he said, I knew you'd be a good daddy when I picked you. And I said, what? And he said, well, when I found you and Mommy, I knew you would be good parents. My head was shrinking to the size of a raisin, my brain. I said, what do you mean when you found us? He said, well, I found you and Mommy, in Hawaii.
James told his father that he saw them in a pink hotel, which is where the Leiningers were staying when they decided to have James. Bruce and Andrea were cautious about asking doctors and psychiatrists for help. They decided to find their own solution to James's ordeal. And their solution was to go to Japan, to the very expansive ocean where the pilot, James Houston Jr., died.
Now you are the pilot of the souls of men.
The boat was right above where the wreckage of the plane was. And Bruce did this beautiful memorial service, and so I thought that was a perfect moment for me to just say, I sat down with them and I said, Jim Houston's been a part of your life for as long as we can remember, and he's always going to be an important part of who you are, but you have a life to live as James Leininger, and it's time for you to say goodbye.
and to Jim Houston, and he just
Started
bawling. And he cried for about 20 minutes.
He had
It
everyone
was the
on the
saddest
boat.
thing I ever seen,
He had everyone on the boat.
crying.
Good job.
I saw you.
Good boy. So brave. You're such a brave soul. Such a brave soul and spirit.
Next is Dr. Walter Semkiw, reincarnation researcher, who talks about her cases which he investigated.
It started actually when I was researching a possible past lifetime for myself. And in the process, I became a scholar on evidence of reincarnation.
These are cases that have emerged